So you might know that I was in Myanmar for a summer and I worked in a cafe, and it did not have coffee or Wi-Fi, and those were two of the big things that were really impeded the cafe, and that the owner talked about a lot as if she wanted to move to the next level. It was all about having coffee, like getting a barista training, having coffee, and getting Wi-Fi. Because in Myanmar, there was this huge expat scene at the time when I lived there. Not so much anymore, because I think the country has more or less shut down, I think still to tourists, or at least it had in the past few years because of war and conflict. But when I was there, it was kind of this golden age where there were a lot of expats living there, and the expats really sought out places that felt almost nostalgic to them. So that's why they went to yoga studios, even if they hadn't tried yoga in their home country, they knew of it, and so they knew they would meet other expats there. And so yoga studios and coffee shops were in that same vein. And I did myself go to coffee shops, this one in particular, a lot, where I spent time just using the Wi-Fi. And I don't think I even drank coffee before that summer that I lived in Myanmar, but because the expats were doing it, and because I had this need for feeling this sense of grounding when everything in the world was so unfamiliar, that's why I gravitated toward coffee and coffee shops. Welcome to the Coffee Witching Hour. My name is Lacey, and this is my podcast that is all about yoga, raising kind humans. Today we're going to be diving into coffee a little bit as well too, which, as you can hear by the title, it's also about that. I am coming to you filming this the day after my birthday. I just celebrated my 32nd birthday yesterday, which is wild because I feel so old. And now that I'm back in grad school, I'm in classes with people who are literally 10 years younger than me, sometimes, mostly in graduate classes. The classes age ranges from like 25-ish to around my age. But yeah, definitely some undergrads in some of the classes as well who are definitely 10 years younger than me. And I'm not the oldest person in the program. I know there are people who are older than me who are in graduate school, but sometimes it can be a little bit like, wow, like how did I get this old? How did I become so, like I feel like I was just in the undergrad's shoes yesterday. Like I feel like I was just back in France studying abroad, doing the program with WashU, and now I'm 10 whole years older than that. And in the same space as some of the people who are going through the experiences that I went through 10 whole years ago, an entire decade. It's amazing how much can happen in that span of time. My first graduate school experience, living around the world, having kids, getting married, all of those things. I'm just, I think, really thankful for all of those experiences and feeling a little bit, I don't know, like, wow, like time moves so fast, like in awe and wonder of how quickly things move. But today I'm going to be talking to you actually about something that is related to some of my coursework. So I am in a public scholarship class this semester that's all about getting your message and getting your work out there to a larger, broader audience earlier on in your career, which I think for me personally, like, I have a podcast, a blog, which is not as active as it used to be when I was like 25-ish maybe. But I have all of those things, and I've been writing for places like Yoga U Online, and have really been trying, I think, in a way to get my voice heard for a broader audience than just academia. So this class really speaks to those experiences, but it's a little bit different because I feel like with all of my public facing work, it's been usually about the fun stuff. Like it's I have blogged a lot about coffee and wine and have shared a lot of my experiences as a yoga teacher and as a doula. And I feel a little bit actually more awkward when I have to share my more academic work with a more public audience. Like I have written blog posts where I just go into the more academic side of things, but it's been interesting because I'm like, well, how do I communicate that to a broader audience without, I know how to make things sound accessible, but without dumbing it down so much that I sound dumb, and that's often a concern for me. So this class has been really good for me to push those concerns aside. I mean, not necessarily, because it's always good to be reflective about the language and always good to be reflective about how you are communicating things and the intention behind your communication and all of that. So not necessarily just push them aside, but to realize that it's okay to share my more academic work with public audiences. And it's okay to be more vocal about the things that I am doing in the classroom and not have to worry quite so much about whether or not it's appropriate to share my work with the wider world. Of course, there is going to be pushback. Of course, there are going to be those people who are like, why is she blogging? Why does she have a podcast? Why does she have this yoga side hustle? All of that. But that's not something, I mean, that's something that I've dealt with and experienced for the last half decade of my life. And I think even before then, even as an undergraduate, I had a style of writing that was maybe more accessible to a broader audience than felt comfortable for a lot of people who are more hardcore into the discipline. I've never been very heavy into using jargon, and if I do, I always want to explain it and say where it's coming from and why I'm presenting the things that I am. So actually, for that public scholarship class, I decided for my final project, which I'm in the works of pitching and working on, to do a book pitch that is actually a little bit on the fun end of things. I don't think I always have to be presenting the hard things that I work on, although I think I will, as I said, I will present more of the stuff that I work on with like maternal health, global health, all of that. I think I will be less afraid to share those to a broader audience. But for this class, the final project that I'm going to be pitching is actually about coffee shops. So today in this episode, without further ado, let's dive into this exciting new project that I'm dreaming up. Okay, so coffee shops. Why would I possibly want to do a project on coffee shops? I think I'm about the most unlikely person to want to pitch something about coffee shops. Just kidding. You know I love coffee shops. You know that I've worked in coffee shops for the better part of my adulthood. Worked in as in not been a barista, although I've tried to go down that path a couple of times. I'm in awe of what baristas do, and I wish I could be a barista myself. I think I was probably a barista in a past life. But anyways, not worked in a coffee shop in that sense so much, but more been one of the people working away on my laptop doing freelance writing and global health consulting projects and things like that, and creative writing projects in coffee shops. They are my happy place. They are the place that I feel so much joy and like nostalgia and so many good feelings when I go into a coffee shop. So of course I'm doing a project on coffee shops because I love them, first of all. But you probably know, if you have been watching or listening to this podcast, you know that my PhD that I'm doing is in French. French literature, language, all of that. And if you know about France, you might know that France has a really, really, really rich history of what's called cafe culture. Basically the culture around going to coffee shops and cafes. And so when I was in Paris in 2018, I spent the summer there in Paris. I went there because I wanted to write a book. I wanted to become an author. I wanted to to get my story out there to the world. I just didn't know what I wanted to write about. So I booked an Airbnb in Montmartre in Paris, where it was this beautiful, beautiful apartment. Well, okay, the apartment was pretty dingy, but it was this beautiful view of the Eiffel Tower that I had. I think I was on like the 7th floor in an apartment with no elevators that was just very small and dirty, but I didn't care. I loved it because at night I could see the Eiffel Tower light up, and it was so amazing. So I booked myself this little writer's cabin kind of thing and decided that I would just write. Except when I got there, I realized I did not know what I wanted to write about. And so I decided to interview people instead. So yeah, so when I was in Paris, I mean, it wasn't just that. I just got caught up with life, with the reality that I did have to work for all of the expenses that come with being in Paris for a summer, like all the macarons and just basically buying food and all of that. I did have to work for it, so I was still juggling some consulting projects, freelance writing, all of that. And so it was an issue of, I didn't know what I wanted to write, but I knew that I had to write for these other places. So really I balanced it out by doing some interviews, and I knew that having a background in qualitative research, I knew that interviews are kind of a big centerpiece of what makes writing interesting for me, like being able to interact with people and hear their stories and record their stories and make that part of a larger body of work is something that I'm just really interested in. So I had this idea to interview people who were doing work in the things that I loved. So I interviewed a bunch of yoga teachers and ended up writing this article about yoga in Paris and how that industry has shifted and changed and all of that. And then I also wrote this article on coffee shops. So I interviewed a bunch of coffee shop owners, not just any coffee shops, but these specialty coffee shops. So the most well-known, like third wave specialty coffee shops in Paris. And so I interviewed those coffee shop owners. So it ended up becoming this beautiful article that, as I said, was published in Fresh Cup. And that kind of opened my eyes in a big way to how coffee shops have really changed over the years, and how yet, despite these changes, they've remained such a big piece of what it means to be in society and to interact with others. And I think that's true in the US as well. But especially in Paris, you see this whole history of cafe culture, and then this new wave of specialty coffee shops that are serving a similar but different purpose. Like with that whole history of coffee shops, there were all of these spaces like Les Deux Mergots, which is a cafe where Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre and Hemingway and like all these other people worked in, and was this space where they met and philosophized and all of this. And now these coffee shops are becoming this more digital workspace, as well as a place that you still meet people and interact with people and share ideas, and this place of building knowledge and sharing knowledge. And so the book pitch will be all about that. It'll be looking at Paris and then Vienna, where I also lived for about 6 months and did this big coffee shop project that was similar and actually really inspired the Paris work, because I went around to the 10 or 12, I think, specialty coffee shops that were in Vienna. It was kind of also this cool, tight-knit network of coffee roasters in Vienna. And so I went around to those different coffee shops and interviewed a couple of baristas and things. But it'll be focusing on Vienna, which has just as equally rich of this history of coffee shop culture, of the coffee house, the history of the coffee house, and Paris. Those two spaces, we'll be focusing a lot on those two cities and their history, as well as some of the other places that I've gone to around the world. So you might know that I was in Myanmar for a summer and I worked in a cafe, and it did not have coffee or Wi-Fi, and those were two of the big things that were really impeded the cafe, and that the owner talked about a lot as if she wanted to move to the next level. It was all about having coffee, like getting a barista training, having coffee, and getting Wi-Fi. Because in Myanmar, there was this huge expat scene at the time when I lived there. Not so much anymore because I think the country has more or less shut down, I think still to tourists, or at least it had in the past few years because of war and conflict. But when I was there, it was kind of this golden age where there were a lot of expats living there, and the expats really sought out places that felt almost nostalgic to them. So that's why they went to yoga studios, even if they hadn't tried yoga in their home country, they knew of it, and so they knew they would meet other expats there. And so yoga studios and coffee shops were in that same vein. And I did myself go to coffee shops, this one in particular, a lot, where I spent time just using the Wi-Fi. And I don't think I even drank coffee before that summer that I lived in Myanmar, but because the expats were doing it and because I had this need for feeling this sense of grounding when everything in the world was so unfamiliar, that's why I gravitated toward coffee and coffee shops. But there's also this question of coffee shops really have popped up everywhere in the world. And there's this beautiful article that was in The Guardian like last January that expresses this idea just so eloquently about how coffee shops have become this part of like the millennials' life, how it's become such a staple for millennials, and how coffee shops used to be a little bit rare. Like it would be kind of rare that you would find a hipster cafe, and you really have to seek it out, like go on Google Maps and plan it out and figure out where these spaces were. And now there's just been this explosion where they are everywhere, and how social media has influenced that so much, and how so many of the coffee shops now look so similar. This article in The Guardian was called Tyranny of the Algorithm, and I'll link also to that because it's just, it expresses it so well, about how all of these coffee shops that have popped up look so similar, and like what is lost in that? What gets lost when everything looks the same? It's kind of the same feeling that a lot of people have expressed about Starbucks. Like every single Starbucks is the same around the country. You know what you're gonna get. The coffee is all a little bit too dark roast, a little bit too sweet if you get the flavoring in it, and it's, you know what you're gonna get. It's all the same. So what gets lost when all of the mom and pop coffee shops are actually just imitating one another? And that article really expresses that well. So it's about that, and it's also about the etiquette that goes into being able to even go to these spaces, right? It's a very privileged thing to be able to just roll in and set up your laptop, and you have to know the etiquette, and you have to look a certain way sometimes. Like you have to almost like be a white person or be a person of privilege, look like a person of privilege to be able to show up to these spaces. And that was true especially in Myanmar. Like it was so, like the number of people who were actually Burmese coming into these expat spaces, whether it was the yoga studio or the coffee shop, were so frequently either expats or Burmese people with a little bit more money. And so there's this kind of aspect of these coffee shops when they're in different places, and even in the US, all honestly, but when they're in places like Myanmar, there's this feeling of them being a little bit colonial, right? And so, and then even, oh my gosh, even in El Paso, when we went there, we went to the neighborhood where Daniel grew up, which used to be a very poor neighborhood, but then there was this coffee shop that had just cropped up that really looked like it could have been in New York, and had all of these Instagram walls set up and all of this. And it was obviously a space that was not for the locals, like not for the people in the neighborhood necessarily, but gentrification, like, was pushing out the people who couldn't afford rent for these houses who had been there for a while. And you could see that, like the coffee shop popping up was kind of a symptom of all of that. So a lot of big topics, right, that we're getting into in this book pitch that I'm eventually going to submit as my final project. But it's a really, really, really interesting one, and I think it speaks to a lot of big questions, right? Like not only what is the history of coffee shops and how have they shifted over the years, to what is the consequence of these coffee shops being these spaces of sameness, of nostalgia, right? Because nostalgia can be a very dangerous emotion, and who is being excluded from them. And yet, it's coming from someone who has benefited from the privilege of going to these coffee shops. As I said, I've frequented them so much in my life, and they're questions that I've thought as I've been sitting in these spaces. And that, you know, it's really a question of examining my own privilege, right? Being able to go to these spaces and know the etiquette and be able to just flip open my laptop and drink my pumpkin spice latte and work there. So who's being excluded and why? And like, how can we make them more inclusive places when the price of these lattes are, you know, it used to be the $5 latte, now it's like the $10 latte, but who is not able to access these spaces, and how can we make them more accessible? So, I mean, and I could go into like, how is a coffee produced? Like some of the more, like, I know Simran Sethi goes into, in her book, Bread, Wine, and Chocolate, goes deeper into like those questions of production of coffee and like, where's the coffee coming from, and are the people who grow the coffee being paid an equitable wage, like the whole fair trade thing that happened with coffee for a while. And I don't even hear about fair trade anymore, but it's more just like direct trade, where the coffee shop owners sometimes go directly to those countries where they're being grown, so they cut out any middlemen. I think fair trade was kind of like that to some extent, but direct trade is even more direct, as the name implies. So I could go into that, but this book pitch is for a book that's about 30,000 words, so let's see what we have the space for. But yeah, so that's my project. It is going to be one that is fun, like coffee shops. It's a fun topic, but it also really touches on a lot of these bigger questions that I'm really excited to dive into. So this is just all my thoughts about what I'm going to put into this final project for now, but we'll get a little deeper into it, and who knows, maybe it'll turn into my actual first published book someday, because, you know, being an author and being able to write is like the biggest thing in my life. And I've written a book before, but I have never published a book. And so we'll see if the timing is right for it. Okay, so that's been a lot. I'm gonna head off to a coffee shop. I will see you soon. But if you have any questions or comments or ideas or even constructive criticism, keep it constructive, please let me know. I'd love to hear your ideas, and I'd love to hear if you have ideas for future episodes, as well as ideas for this project that I'm working on. But I will see you soon.